During the 28 years that I've lived on the mountain here in Healdsburg, I had two dogs. The first one was called Remedy, a mutt that won the Palo Alto Mutt Show in 1989. And he died some years ago. And then I adopted a dog called Kayla. And she was the reincarnation of Remedy, although they were totally different kinds of dogs. And I had Kayla for many, many years. And we would spend hours and hours and hours trekking in the hills and the woods and the creeks around here. And we had many interdimensional encounters together. And this is one that happened on March 10th, 2009. I call it bath time. I haven't seen such a sight since my childhood days in Ireland. A young mother bathing her newborn infant out of doors. It stopped me in my tracks, and I was flooded with memories, some my own, and some far more ancient than mine. I wondered if I should just pass by, but I couldn't. I was utterly fascinated. The mother was in her teens, but with the kind of face that morphs continually, now with the aspect of an innocent child, now with the aspect of a vibrant teenager, then with the aspect of a sedate matron, and finally with the aspect of a wise old woman. A shock of thick red tresses tumbled down her back beyond her waist. She was kneeling beside a stone tub in which she was carefully and ever so gently washing her newborn boy child. He had the mesmerizingly blue eyes of his mother, but with a mop of black curly hair. The mother's own locks were floating in the water, and these were the washcloths with which she bathed her babe, silky fibers that caressed his pink body and brought a toothless smile to his ruby red lips. I said, "Baloyer erninon," the blessing of God on your infant. She turned her sky blue eyes on me and replied, "On valchen art," the same blessing be upon yourself. In an instant, I knew whence she was. She was a woman of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and her infant was a fairy child. Immediately, I understood what had really happened 15 minutes before. Kayla, my dog, and I had been climbing down the steep hillside, following a rocky ravine, which was channeling the excess water from the rains of the last few weeks. We had come to a particularly tricky place, very steep and very rocky. I thought long and hard about proceeding. It would be a difficult and a dangerous route ahead. But the alternative was to climb back up and undo the work of the last hour. I opted to try my luck. I was hampered by the fact that while I had my sturdy walking stick in my right hand, my left hand was dedicated to carrying a deer skull with huge antlers, which I had found on the hillside about 20 minutes before. I wasn't willing to abandon it. At that point, the two slopes of the opposing hillsides had vectored into a V shape through which the water was cascading with quite some force. Holding my stick and the antlers, I used my elbows once against each wall to lower myself into the crevice. When I set my feet on the bottom, it was so narrow that one foot got jammed. I had a fleeting vision of being found next year, a human skeleton holding a big antlered deer skull and a walking staff. I managed to wrestle my foot free. The water was mid-thigh and the pool about 15 feet long. I half waded, half elbowed my way to the end. There, it dropped off into a 6 feet high waterfall. As I was trying to figure out a way down, I heard Kayla crying. When I looked back, I saw that she was spread-eagled, 2 legs on each rock face, sliding and scraping and getting no purchase. She was freaking out, unable to either proceed or reverse. I tried to encourage her to come to me, but her nails just scored the rock and she continued to slide, sometimes slipping under the water. So I set aside the skull and the stick and waded back into the pool. I grabbed hold of her collar and pulled her after me all the way to the end. Then we found a way down the waterfall, but only to be met with a surprise. The next level contained exactly the same setup, except now the water was waist deep. Having retrieved the stick and the skull, I elbow waded my way to the end of the second pool, only to discover that once more, Kayla was stranded and crying pitifully. Again, I laid aside my baggage and went back to rescue her. She resisted and had to really pull hard to get her moving. We did it. Now the way forward was relatively simple, but that was when she grew really fearful. It was then, having rounded a corner, that I saw the mother and child. Only now did I understand that most of Kayla's fear was that she had detected, long before I had, that we were about to jump dimensions, to step through the veil into a coilite. The bathtub in which the fairy mother was bathing her infant was another rock pool set in the crevice of the hillside. I knew that she was as ancient as the mountain itself. She reached out her hand and stroked Kayla, who had been cowering by my side, and it worked. Kayla started to wag her tail. Then she licked the woman's hand and finally began to lick the baby's face. The baby, the mother, and I all broke into huge grins. She only said one more thing to me before she vanished. Treat this mountain as lovingly as you've seen me wash my infant. It wasn't only a message for me, it was a message through me. Then, like a cloud that changes contours in the sky, finally teasing itself asunder and disappearing, mother and child began to shapeshift until they completely dissolved. The portal closed. Kayla and I were alone once more. I sat by the pool for a long time, trying to emblazon their features on my mind's eye and their message on my soul. Words inspired by God. From January 1956, my family and I lived at number 9 St. Joseph's Park in Mayfield in County Cork. And like everybody else in the area, we had our milk delivered by a farmer who would come around every single morning with his horse and cart. And he had a huge big 30-gallon churn of milk and a big long-handled ladle that he dipped down into the churn. And the women of the park would come up with their jugs, and he'd take the ladle of milk, dip it into the churn, and fill their milk jugs for them. And every May 1st, he would have a special flower on the horse's bridle, on the halter of the horse. It was always apple blossom. And the reason was obvious. We always knew it. It was May 1st. It was Bealtaine. It was a sacred feast when it's a thin place and a thin day in the Celtic calendar. It's a time when the veil between the unseen and the seen, between the mystical and the mundane, is diaphanous, and the fairies came through. And so he was actually protecting his horse against any kind of fairy intrusions, because they were really, really active on that day. And we all just understood. We took it for granted. That's what you did on May 1st. There was a kind of a dark side to it as well, because on that day, if neighbors had a dispute, particularly if they were farmers, one person would put eggs, hide eggs in the other person's barn. And the belief system was, if you did it on May 1st, that when the eggs went bad, his crops would fail, and the cows wouldn't give any milk. So on the 1st of May, every farmer would do a complete search of the barns to make sure somebody hadn't hidden eggs under a haystack someplace. And I remember one May 1st, as a young boy outside playing around, and I brought back a branch of a white thorn bush, and my grandmother and Nana freaked out. She said, "Take that out of the house and bring it back and put it back exactly where you found it." Because the white thorn bush is very sacred to the fairies. And to take a branch off that and bring it into the house, you were just asking for trouble. So I had to go back out. It was about 1.5 miles, trek out and find the tree from which they'd broken the branch and put it back underneath the tree. And so that's what I want to talk about today, in a sense. Today is Bealtaine, and it's a very special time, obviously, for us Celts, but also it's a very important time for people who love Mother Mary, because May is Mary's month, And so I'm going to have to try to combine in today's homily, Celtic considerations and Motherhood of Mary considerations. So it's going to be a one standalone homily, because typically, I take a theme for a month. I devote the first Sunday and the second Sunday to developing the theme. The third Sunday, I do a recap and a Q&A, and then the fourth Sunday is Community Sunday. But May has 5 Sundays in it. And so today will be a standalone homily dedicated to, I would call it Bealtaine, the Celts, and Christa Consciousness. And then next Sunday, with God's help, and the Sunday after, I'll develop a new theme, the theme of the ascension of humankind, Gaia, and the cosmos. And then May 22nd will be the Community Mass. And then May 29th, I'll do a recap and a Q&A. But today is dedicated to the Celts and to Christa Consciousness. So the first thing I want to mention about the Celts is that Bealtaine actually in Gaelic means, Bealtaine means fire in Gaelic, and Beal is actually adopted from the Middle East. It is Baal, and Baal was one of the ancient names for the gods, different gods. In fact, Baal just means master. There was actually a very famous Jewish mystic in the Middle Ages that was called the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the sacred name. And so Baal just means master, or godlike, or extraterrestrial, or sky being, whatever you want to call it. So Bealtaine was the feast of the fire of that realization. So for us Celts, it's the start of the summer. May 1st is the start of the summer. America got it wrong completely. When you think about May starting on like the 21st of June, that's right in the middle of the summertime. So the days before it and the days after are the same length. And so for us Celts, summer begins on the 1st of May, Bealtaine. So I'm trying to combine then Bealtaine and Mariology today. So the first point I want to make is that in the Celtic system, light and dark are not enemies of each other. They're dancing partners. That the dark, fecund womb gives birth to the light. So light is birthed from the dark. So they're partners in this extraordinary cosmic dance, and this global dance, and this climatic dance, and this circadian dance. So the Celts lead us into the realization that dark and light do this extraordinary loving dance together. So there's a mystical core to this, because I believe, I've spoken many times about what I call the 5 L's. The 5 L's for me are love, light, logos, life, and laughter. And my cosmology suggests that love is the origin of all that is. But love gave birth to twins, light and logos. And light is the origin of all matter, which why matter literally means matter, or mother, is the same word etymologically. Matter and matter, mother is the same word. So light is the origin of all matter. In quantum mechanics, we know that light is literally frozen matter. And so matter is the stuff. And then logos is the consciousness that fashions it, that's responsible for morphology, that from the same matter, from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, it creates, daffodils, or oak trees, or kitty cats, or dogs, or human beings. So logos is what fashions it. So my belief system then is that these two forms dance with each other, light and logos, and they give birth to life in all its manifestations. And the objective of all life is to learn how to laugh at the illusion that we are separate from God, to laugh at the illusion that we're separate from nature, and to laugh at the illusion that we're separate from each other. So for me, those are the 5 L's, beginning with love, then light, then logos, then life, and then laughter. Now, I'm thinking for the last few days in the sense that light, another word for light is Christa Consciousness. And another word for logos is Christ consciousness. So it is Christa consciousness and Christ consciousness dancing together that create all life anywhere in the universe. And then laughter, as I say, is the objective of life. It is breaking out of the illusion. One of my favorite passages in the Gnostic scriptures is taken from the Gospel of Philip, where he says, Jesus went down into the Jordan to be baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. And when he came out of the river, he started laughing. It's like the final penny finally dropped, and you could see the entire illusion of everybody around him. And he put his head back and just this huge, big belly laugh. And so for me, the mystical core of it then is looking at these 5 L's. But there's a whole other agenda as well in our world. And I call it the secularist agenda. So for me, it's predicated on there being 2 different kinds of darkness. One of them I would call the welcoming womb that conceives all possible manifestations of light. And then the other one is, I would call it the turgid tomb that extinguishes all forms of love. So there's this titanic struggle that goes on in incarnation between the 2 forms of the darkness, the fertile womb that gives birth to all possible manifestations of love, and the turgid tomb that kills every manifestation of love. So this second kind of darkness is the one that continually turns love into hate. It turns light into an oppressive kind of a darkness. It turns logos, which is meant to be the good news, into propaganda. It turns life into death, and it turns laughter into weeping. So that's the second kind of darkness. And you find that permeates through all kinds of human institutions, including the church itself. And so you look at these great light givers that came 2,000 years ago, Mary and Jesus and the Magdalene and John. And by the 12th century, Jesus himself has been turned into a judge who's coming to separate the sheep from the goats and to give one group the thumbs down. The vast majority are going to get a thumbs down and go to hell for all eternity. And the lucky few will get a thumbs up and go to heaven for all eternity. So now, Logos has become a loveless message where it had been a message of love. And so at this stage, the people of Europe and in Ireland in particular, there was only one place else to turn to, and that was to turn to the light, to turn to Mary, the archetype of the light. And so in turning to Mary, the great spirituality, the mystical spirituality that emerged from that, and my own great-grandmother had that in spades. She talked to Mary on a daily basis out loud, and I was privy to such conversations. So my first experiences of spirituality were the mysticism of Mariology, of my great-grandmother talking to Mary. And so now Mary is tasked in the 12th century with holding a new kind of love, of bearing a new kind of light, of creating a new kind of logos, and symbolizing a new form of life. And so it's at this stage you get all of the great hymns to Mary being created, all the great cathedrals of Europe being dedicated to Mary, and the rosary being created as the prayer to Mary. So bereft even of Jesus, we're now turning to Mary. So like all great light forms, the church would try to turn that into warfare as well. There was a very famous battle fought it was the 7th of October in 1571. It's called the Battle of Lepanto, where a coalition of Catholic states arranged by the Pope at the time, a guy called Pius V, were inflicted a major defeat on the fleet of the Ottoman Empire. And they were using Mary as their token. So they created, to honor that day, they created the Feast of Mary's Rosary. The 7th of October every year now is the Feast of the Rosary. So they've turned Mary into a war machine to defeating, the enemy figures. So there's an attempt on the part of the church to turn even Mary into a warmonger. And we've done the same thing in many different Christian countries. I remember when I came to the States in 1987, being really, really shocked when I heard that there was an American battleship which was called the Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. I couldn't believe it. That a military craft capable of destroying enemies was given the name of the body of Christ. So there's no end to what we're prepared to do to turn the light into darkness, or to turn the fecund, fertile darkness that gives birth to light into a darkness that gives birth only to deeper forms of darkness. So that's what I would say about the notion of light and dark. I want to look at then, that leads me to a consideration of form and emptiness. There's this beautiful Buddhist notion that form is emptiness and emptiness is form, that everything that exists comes from that which was not, and everything that was not is capable of birthing all that could possibly be. So form is emptiness and emptiness is form. The beautiful Buddhist Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who died just very recently, picked up a flower one time and he said, a flower consists completely of non-flower elements. There would not be a flower if you took away the sun and chlorophyll, if you took away the rain, if you took away water, if you took away the soil, if you took away the insects, and if you took away the herbivores that spread it, there would not be a flower. And so I think of that as kind of, I would call it macro entanglement. So everything connected to everything else. In a sense, once anything goes out of existence, everything else begins to suffer immediately. John Bell, a very famous Irish physicist in the 1960s, came up with the theory of entanglement, that subatomic particles, which are paired and then sent off into different parts of the universe, immediately affect each other. If you cause a change in one, the other immediately changes at a speed much, much faster than the speed of light. And that's called entanglement. I would see Thich Nhat Hanh's story of the flower as, I would call it, macro entanglement. It's not just microscopic elements that are connected to each other. Everything that exists, everything that has existed, and everything that can exist is irrevocably entangled with each other. Now, it's interesting that I just realized this actually a few days ago. There's a word in Swahili called tupu, spelled T-U-P-U, T-U-P-U. And tupu in Swahili means two very contradictory things. It means empty and it means complete or full. So if I say to you, for instance, nyumba iko tupu, I'm saying to you, the house is empty. But if I say to you, niko na furaha tupu, I'm filled with happiness. I'm using exactly the same word, tupu. So tupu can mean emptiness completely, or it can mean fullness completely. So it's interesting that even in languages, in the Swahili language, we capture this extraordinary dance between form and emptiness. They're indistinguishable from each other in a sense. And I began thinking for the last few days as well about when I examine the near-death phenomenon. And if you know about the near-death phenomenon, it is people who've been pronounced clinically dead and have been resuscitated. And they talk about this extraordinary journey at the other side. And almost inevitably, the journey into the afterlife starts with a radical form of darkness. But this darkness is not fearful. It's absolutely wondrous. It brings its own extraordinary sense of peace and love. But it starts with darkness. And then there's a tunnel, some kind of like a birth canal. And then a light appears at the end of the tunnel and starts getting larger and larger and larger. Or you're moving closer and closer and closer to it. But it's extraordinary light, really, really bright, but it doesn't blind in any way. And as it gets larger and larger and larger, it gives birth to this unconditional love. And then logos happens. A voice invites you to go further into the explanation. So we started with love, now we're meeting the light, and now we're meeting the logos. And this logos, this is an invitation into a much deeper form of life, a much higher form of life. So now you get the five L's represented right there. But at some stage in the near-death experience, there's a barrier. You reach someplace and you're told you can't come any further because your work isn't yet complete on this incarnation. So you're given a life review to look at what you have accomplished and what you still need to do in this particular incarnation. And so you're sent back, and people come back with a totally renewed sense of mission and purpose. Perhaps for most of them, they understand for the very first time who they are, why they came, and what they volunteered for. But they weren't finished, and so a barrier was set up in order for them to come back. Now, in my meditations for the last few days, I've been seeing this happen, that we're in the process of, I would call it, a global near-death experience with all of the same possibilities. There's the darkness of our times, and obviously we're all very aware of it. But there's a light in the darkness, and there's a voice in the darkness. There's a logos in the darkness. There's a higher form of life possible in that darkness, but there is a barrier. And the barrier is the invitation to do a life review, not just as individuals, not just even as communities, but as a global family, to do a life renew as to how we've been conducting ourselves on planet Earth for 70,000 years, so that we can go back and complete the mission. And I think we have reached this place many, many times. There have been many, many beginnings. In the Hebrew scriptures, as I keep pointing out, the very first word in the Hebrew Bible is Breshit, which does not mean in the beginning. If they wanted to say in the beginning, they would have said Barishit. They didn't. They said Breshit, which means in a beginning. There have been many, many beginnings. We've reached this place, in our evolutionary trajectory over perhaps millions and millions of years, in which we've even broken down because of human inability to accept the mission. We're at a stage right now, there's a global near-death experience occurring right now. The question is, can you surf the darkness to find the light? And when you find the light, can you listen to the Logos? And when you reach the barrier, can you use the barrier as an invitation to do a life review for Homo sapiens sapiens, and then move in to the next stage of our journey? Which brings me down to be thinking about the feminine face of God in this stage of human evolution. And it's fascinating to me when I look at very, very many different languages, they all have this notion of a feminine face of God, very, very different names. In Gaelic, we call it An Bhaidhsinn Mhuire, the Virgin Mother, or the Virgin Mary. In Buddhism, she's known as Tara. In Judaism, she's known as Shekhinah. In Hinduism, she's known as Shakti. And in the Kalenjin languages, it's fascinating to me. The Kalenjin peoples had many, many different names for God. One of the names was Chepkelian Sahal, which literally means the nine-legged one. And it comes from the image of when you're looking at the sun setting in the west, they're like legs shooting through holes in the clouds. So it looks like God is walking on 9 legs. So they call it Chepkelian Sahal, the nine-legged one. Another name for God is Assis, from the word for the sun. The sun is Assista in Kalenjin languages. So Assis, in some senses, is the sun aspect of God. But the one that's used and is used in the Bible when the missionaries began to translate from the original into Kalenjin languages, the word they chose was Cheptulel. And in Kalenjin, Cheptulel literally means the shiny maiden, or the white maiden, or the bright maiden. So it's some kind of, almost like an extraterrestrial entity, or kind of a light being from elsewhere. And that's the word that we use, the main word we use for God. You translate the Bible into Kalenjin, and when you meet the word God, that's how to be translated into Kalenjin, Cheptulel, the bright maiden, the shining maiden, or the white maiden in some senses. So for me, it represents that this feminine face of God manages to break through even into the most patriarchal of societies. And it's like it's a Trinitarian formula as well. There's a great passage in the Gnostic Gospel of Philip where he says, there were 3 who always walked with the Lord. There was his mother Mary, her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion. And he says his sister, his mother, and his companion were all called Mary. And for me, in some senses, that represents for me the feminine face of the Trinity. So if you want to know, look what, instead of Father, Son, and Spirit, which is the masculine face of the Trinity, you have a feminine face of Trinity, which is the 3 Marys that were part of Jesus' safari. So in conclusion, what I think is this, that when I go back to that encounter I had on March 2009, on going down to the creek from my home, I see now that it was actually a combination of different kinds of realities. It was the mother and child of the Tuatha Dé Danann from 2,500 years ago. It was Mary, Mother Mary, and Jesus shortly after his birth in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. And it was Christa Consciousness and Christ consciousness from before the time the cosmos was even conceived. So for me, that encounter of mine, as I think back on it now, it was three time fractals, all pointing to the same reality, all pointing to the invitation for Homo sapiens sapiens to become Homo spiritualis. The question for myself and for you is this: are you ready for the birthing? Are you ready for the labor pains? Because they're going to get intense. And God willing, for the next Sundays of May, I want to develop that a little bit further. Namaste.